Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Tech Innovation in 2025, Themes and Technologies to Monitor. My name is Anthony Schiavo, a Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'll be joined today by my colleagues Chris Robinson, Senior Director, Yunsheng Yu, Senior Director, and Josh Haslam, Senior Director, all here at Lux Research. Throughout this presentation, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is still strong. And with that, let's jump into the discussion. So the theme of this webinar is tech innovation in 2025, but I think it is worth starting with a little bit of a look back on 2024. 2024 was a momentous year. We had big political shifts. We had some major economic shifts. I want to start it off, though, by asking, what did 2024 teach us about tech innovation? What were some of the key themes from that year? So, Chris, I'll turn it over to you first. What are your views on this?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. So, working primarily with the energy industry, I think we really saw maybe a return to focusing on near-term opportunities. If you look back, maybe between 2020 and 2023 or so, there was a lot of investor pressure to identify a net zero roadmap. So what is this organization going to look like in a long-term net zero future? But I think really what we've seen in the last year is a bit of reshifting those priorities. Investors have shifted. They're really prioritizing financial returns. We've seen a lot of companies, things like reducing headcount, reprioritizing some of their decarbonization goals to help allow some ability to meet some of those financial pressures. At the same time, on the startup side of things, that meant funding was really drying up, right? There was a lot of concern over what are the exit opportunities for these startups. So, if I think about what happened in 2024, it was maybe a year of bringing things back to reality. Right, of understanding there has to be a business case for a lot of the innovation projects companies are deploying in a shorter timeline to profitability.
Josh, what are your thoughts on this question?
I kind of want to follow up on what Chris said on, thinking about investors driving major shifts in what we saw funding happen in, 2021 to 2023. Everybody says, oh, funding is going through the roof. Really, this is a blip. If you look at, 2025, 2024 right now, funding's back to normal. To be honest, if you look at prior to sort of COVID level funding, we're still increasing, but it's back to normal. And so how do we also now rein ourselves in, to Chris's point? And when we think about the consumer industry, for me, I think what we got to learn is how do we not allow ourselves to get bought into hype or novelty, because that's where a lot of that money went in the industry I focus on. So, how do we move away from these disguised, big, impactful ideas that are going to change the world and really assess them more clearly? How do we identify real emerging trends that we can act on? How do we identify the innovations that we can push across, any type of valley of death, something like that? How do we time our path to market? Because what we saw, right, is there was a lot of failure, to be honest, right? Biosynthesis had a lot of failures. We can look at cannabinoid production, all those companies that came up saying we're going to produce the future of XYZ for CBD or rare cannabinoids. None of that materialized because of costs or policy not really there to back. So, and that wasn't the only area. We have everything from alternative proteins to this. So really we need to focus and stop just throwing darts at the wall. I think that's the big thing we learned. And that even during times where we are flush with cash, we need to choose much better. We need to look for market-ready opportunities, or we need to identify the timelines for tipping points to focus on.
Yeah, I think Chris and Josh really nailed the one and only theme, right, for innovation from last year. That over-optimism for markets that haven't really materialized yet. And certainly not as smooth and seamless as we all painted it out to be. For the chemicals industry, I think that's definitely what they went through, right? I think sustainability's run, it's pretty much ended. in 2024 as an innovation driver. It's still, of course, a corporate strategy and has more to do than just kind of sustainability in general. But it was a really harsh reality check from a technology perspective, right? A lot of companies realized that there was limited value proposition for pursuing sustainable innovations purely for sustainability's sake. That's not to say there are a few nice stories to tell, projects to showcase, but to Josh's point, right, true market needs and consumer preferences still, ultimately prevailed. And the fact is that, whether it's the lowest cost solution or the most convenient solution, that's still going to really continue to win out as sort of sustainability struggled to find a business case in the grand scheme of things, right? I think this showed up quite a bit in a lot of our conversations throughout the years with folks in the industry. Some acknowledged sort of overcorrecting to the sustainability hype. And like Chris said, got a little bit too carried away with it all. But, all of them emphasize that it's still important, but, the path forward right now is really just good old fashioned innovation in sort of materials sciences, advancements in chemistries, to really just target, the true growth and market expansion opportunities that their businesses have. And I think that's really the big takeaway for 2024 is like the market's going to determine what succeeds. And after the previous few years, a sustainability market sort of worth pursuing for a lot of these larger companies just didn't emerge or wasn't big enough for them.
So I'm definitely hearing that a bit of retrenchment is the theme here. But I want to push back a little bit because there have been what I would call structural changes. In the United States, we have things like the tax credits for carbon capture and hydrogen production. And we invested billions, hundreds of billions in a lot of these different technologies. Rather than moving away from it entirely, aren't we just going to pursue it a little bit more pragmatically going forward? Or is this really a full-on retreat from sustainability?
No, I think you bring up a good point, Anthony. I hope we don't paint it all as all kind of doom and gloom. I think there are really good near-term opportunities out there. I can think of a couple, right? ExxonMobil talking about building 1.5 gigawatts of natural gas turbines with carbon capture for the data center industry is a great example. Exxon's very clearly trying to be a carbon management company. They've partnered with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and they want to go to a variety of heavy industries, things like steel producers, et cetera, to go sell them carbon management solutions, right? But those industries, very slow to change, low margin, high capex, very long timelines to change. Meanwhile, you have the data center industry popping up, very high need for low carbon power, willing to pay a premium for the speed of access to that power and its carbon intensity. And you have Exxon kind of adjusting its tactics within its long-term strategy to find something a little bit nearer-term opportunity revenue-wise. Right. Saw the same thing with a lot of the European super major oil and gas companies within electrification, right? Backing away from retail markets where it's really difficult to really make any money, but also still being active in project development for things like utility scale wind and solar.
Yeah, Chris makes a good point there, and maybe I'll follow up because when we look at the industrial sector, things like industrial conglomerates, machinery and equipment manufacturers, and even engineering and construction firms, there are still sort of short-term opportunities for them. They're kind of patiently waiting to jump on the long-term opportunities that a lot of these energy companies are looking to kind of achieve and transform into. But in the near term, they will keep selling the machines and equipments that they've had for different applications. So they kind of can play both sides, right? They're kind of lucky in that sense because the industrial sector has a little bit less skin in the game. They're not an energy player, so to speak, kind of building on Chris's talk about ExxonMobil, oil and gas, and utilities. But at the same time, they're sort of methodically building up sort of that portfolio of products and solution offerings to ensure that they can remain agile to capitalize when the time comes, both near and long term.
Yeah. And I'm just going to, again, I don't know why we're agreeing so much, but because we don't do this when we're normally talking to each other, right, guys? But in this case, yeah, I mean, agility is clearly needed. And as I brought up before, when we think about opportunities, it's not like there's no innovations out there. The reality is we have tons of innovations. They've just been used as one-hit wonders. And if we're going to be more agile, And then this is, I think, an important bit of learning here. To become more agile, we have kind of two ways to do it, right? One is we can change what we're able to put into a piece of technology, right? Feedstocks, things like that, when we think about biosynthesis. Or we need to think about how to pull additional technologies together. In most cases, I have lots of examples here, but we can take an emerging area like next generation breeding, right? We're thinking about the future of using CRISPR and a lot of different technologies to inform what we're going to grow in the future. And if we take that idea and you look at a company like Inari that has not only the technology, but all the experience, the creative people, right, to create opportunities, the reality is you can't do it without that. So we really need to just think about how to use these technologies more in a sort of more mature way, right, where we partner, we balance costs, capabilities to achieve that impact in the end.
So what I'm hearing, I think, is a lot of focus, right? There was maybe a bit of a money geyser in the 2020 through 2022 timeframe. I think we certainly saw that in VC markets and across governments as well. And I think that really, in a lot of ways, changed the mindset. I'm sure you guys had these conversations, but a lot of our clients went from not really focusing on policy at all to really saying, hey, we need government support to do almost any type of innovation. And that became much more of a focus. So the question now is, as we move forward into 2025, what is going to really define the innovation landscape? And I don't want to hear from the two Debbie Downers. So Josh, I'm going to go to you first. I want to hear a little bit more optimism about 2025, or at least a little bit of your perspective. Well, what's really going to define this this year? Is it going to be more of the same from 2024, or are there going to be different things for us to look forward to?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be an interesting year or 4 years or however we want to play our, thinking about, let's think about that 2030 horizon, right? Because I think that's really what we're thinking about as we plan. So first and foremost, it's clearly about shifting policy directions. But the question is not, okay, policy is going to shift, but how does that drive opportunities? And as building on what we said before, their timing, right? How do we say, do we delay focus on something and move focus to something else? And that, I think, is going to be really important for folks to think about. Second, again, we can't forget about maturing technologies. The fact is, we had a lot of money. That money did go to maturing some technologies. Did they necessarily make it to market? No, but they're getting closer to readiness, and we need to think about how to use them or fill in the gaps for them to open up opportunities. And then third, the other big one is the short-term gain of saying we're going to see a lot of companies looking to diversify their portfolios with maybe even, I would say, not necessarily maturing technologies, but mature technologies, mature products. How do we diversify that, or take your mature technology and diversify it? So, I just want to dive in maybe a little bit more into the policy first and say, why policy? Well, why is it interesting? I'm clearly thinking about consumers, and we have some pretty ambitious thoughts coming forward, I think, for consumer, particularly when it comes to health and safety. There's going to be opportunities around the future of ingredients. So that's why I keep bringing up the idea of biosynthesis. It has a place. We have a lot of challenges coming up, and so from the policy direction, it's about ingredients of concern. It's about grass moving towards ingredients of concern, towards being banned. What does that actually look like? And yes, we have some time to think about this. Things probably won't move as fast as the world believes, but it's something we really need to pay attention to, especially as we think about repositioning technologies to serve those and say, okay, dyes might be really important in the future. Flavors might be really important in the future to be able to produce in different ways. So beyond that, I think the second thing, maturing technologies, we've talked about this a bit, but let's think about AI. And I want to, maybe just leave it there and say discovery, formulation, prototyping, ingredients, even automation. All these things are going to be impacted by this mature technology. What can we do with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I like the phrase maturing technologies. And I think the way I also think about that is, when we have conversations with a lot of our clients and innovation teams, it's not just about maturing technologies, but maturing opportunities. right? That's kind of what the data center use case is, right? As some of the applications of those technologies are finally maturing. And I think that's a conversation that we've increasingly found ourselves having, is not just talking about, how does DAC work? What are advancements in fusion, some of these long-term technologies, but also thinking about, are there the near-term opportunities and use cases for these technologies that are emerging? So I think in the energy space, we'll see more of that, more of finding kind of those opportunities, applying high TRL technologies to maybe newer problems and opportunities.
Mm. So I think, Josh, you mentioned 3 points, and we talked about 2 of them, but the third was really on diversification, right? Diversification of a technology portfolio. Can you say a few words on that quickly while we, as we think about innovation next year?
Yeah, and I'll build on what I said. Health and safety. It's going to be a big area of growth for the consumer industry. When we think about diversification, what have we seen already? I think at the end of 2024, we actually saw a lot of this. A lot of big purchases around healthy snacking, for instance. It's not about diminishing flavor, diminishing anything like that. It's about just having maybe more whole foods, hitting clean label in a more targeted way to attract consumers. So that's happening, but it's not just that. It's also the notion of, as I said before, diversifying your ability to hit new industries. And I'll just point, we have a lot of potential for disruption coming up. Everything about risk mitigation. So in that, let's face it, we have livestock disruptions going on right now. There's potential for disease disruptions to affect us. And lastly, and always these days, we have the complexity of regional weather challenges. So all these things are creating opportunities. Again, what can we do with our portfolios or diversifying our portfolios that help us in? And that's going to be a big focus.
Really like Josh's point here on risk mitigation. And I guess as the resident doom and gloom analyst, he really outlined some examples of all sorts of potential risks and disruptions that companies are going to face. I would actually, looking at 2025, take that one step further. Right. I think he said growth through diversification. I'd actually think we're going to see a lot more initiatives around growth through resilience. I think we're seeing, sort of this great peak globalization era that we've really witnessed over the last several decades. And you're starting to see some of the movements and pieces kind of shifting towards a little slightly more fragmented global economy, right? There's certain regions that are kind of forming alliances and looking more regionally. And I think this will set up a new paradigm for innovation, right? At first glance, right? The geopolitical tensions, the rivalries, I think there's been a handful of tariffs already signed in the last 48 hours. It looks like it's going to hinder a lot of that collaboration and sort of collaborative environment we've seen around technology development over the last few decades. But at the same time, I think it also spawns a lot of different types of innovation focuses, especially as governments start to prioritize protecting and fostering sort of their own national champions, especially in really key strategic sectors, right? This creates interesting opportunities for companies, especially as those that compete mostly domestically or can compete domestically, to sort of exploit and explore a little bit more. This sort of new wave of for us, by us sort of mentality that really sparks localized innovations tailored to address domestic and regional specific challenges rather than sort of aiming to solve these big global problems that most companies have been focused on. Doom and gloom aside, obviously, I'm not hoping for a complete collapse of global cooperation, but regional needs will start to take a priority, right? Such as the risk mitigation Josh discussed, and it'll set a stage for some really interesting advancements, especially in things like critical minerals, raw material supply, and even in health and food safety. And, these technology advancements will really be aimed at self-reliance, right, as it becomes more prominent this year.
Yeah, I think resilience is absolutely the watchword of 2025 and really of the rest of the 2020s. And I think it's easy to focus on the political because it's so high profile, right? And especially right now. But I think the infrastructural and the climate is, in my mind, just as important, if not more important. Donald Trump has talked a lot about the Panama Canal, but the Panama Canal experienced a really severe drought in the last, 2 years. And, it's entirely possible that, the Panama Canal will be taken, if not out of service, then have dramatically reduced service entirely outside of those political factors, right? If you're shipping things then through that channel, that you're really going to have to change your operations, change your markets, change your, your whole supply chain potentially to adjust for that. So it's crucial, I think, to consider resilience, not just to these splashy political factors, but really across the whole spectrum of what's possible. And so, our clients, they have a responsibility, of course. It's not just about big picture chin stroking. It's also about actually doing their jobs, getting their hands dirty, and investing in technologies. And so the question I want to ask the three of you is, which technologies will lead the way in 2025 and also beyond? And I'm breaking this up, I think, because it's important to recognize our clients. I think they're all feeling the pressure to produce those returns in the near term. I know CEOs and investors are pressing for that. But it's also crucial not to let the long-term advantage slip. I think we all know that innovation is a source of that. So I'll first ask, with an eye on the near term, what's one technology that you want to invest in or that you're excited about? And Chris, I'll hand it over to you first for this question.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's always it's a fun question to get, but it's hard to pick one.
Mm-hmm.
Something I think we've been noticing a lot more interest in is thermal energy storage. So the ability to store heat, similar to how we store electricity in batteries. And I say this, excuse me, I say this for a couple of reasons. One, I think it has been underinvested in the past compared to the need. If you look at how much we use heat and produce heat and potentially reuse heat, haven't seen the amount of investments in that space that maybe we should have seen. But also, industries that need heat are starting to step up and say, we're ready to deploy some solutions.
Okay.
The other reason I think it's really attractive is it's very low capital costs, right? The storage mediums are talking about sand, crushed rocks, very low capital expenditures. The challenge with thermal energy storage is always system integration, right? So how do you actually get it integrated into an industrial process is the challenge. So might see some overinflated expectations from startups that are able to show some really compelling results in the lab. So focus on integration within thermal energy storage.
Chris brings up a good point there about integration. I think certainly, especially for our coverage of technologies and oil and gas, as Chris mentioned, but also in industrials and chemicals, it's really the final piece of the puzzle, right? How can this technology actually integrate into these assets that these companies already have? For 2025, not saying everyone's figured it out or going to figure it out, but there's early signs that plastic pyrolysis will be a near-term play in the chemicals and oil and gas sector. There's some hesitancy and pushback in the previous years, especially during the sort of sustainability craze. But starting to see that's going to end up mostly being noise as it starts to demonstrate not only a viable business case, but sort of a feasible path to integrating with a lot of these companies' core businesses. Again, in a lot of the conversations we've been having, it's become clear that the industry has identified it as the most feasible approach for advanced plastic recycling. And we're starting to see some smart money flowing in, right? There's definitely a lot more new generations related to advanced plastic recycling technologies, but they're still a lot behind in terms of maturity. And even when they scale up, they're going to face a lot of the same challenges beyond sort of the core tech and into the value chain that plastic pyrolysis players are starting to figure out. But to Chris's point, and just to kind of level set here, it's not going to be overly easy. It's not really a plug and play solution. We actually don't expect more than half of the announced projects that were supposed to be completed this year to start operations. But players like, I guess another ExxonMobil example, but players like ExxonMobil, really put together a winning formula, right? They took control not only of the tech, but also of the feedstock management portion. And, they just in the last 6 months put in another $350-400 million into the space to kind of support its growing capacity. At the end of the day, it's nothing particularly novel, right? The core tech, as well as just managing waste. But it highlights sort of that pragmatic approach of kind of successfully deploying a near-term technology, especially in 2025.
Yeah, and I like that you highlighted both the technology as well as the supply chain that they're building. Josh, what are your thoughts on this?
Again, doubling down on the idea that novelty's not going to be your way to impact in the short term here, especially when we think about consumers. I don't care what the government does, but those tariffs are the costs getting passed to the consumer, so they're going to be a bit wary with their dollar. We will all be wary with our dollar, I should say. Yeah, and the reality is that we've said this now several times, but there are technologies out there, and there's real opportunities to connect those dots, and that's what you need to look to. And this may be boring, but I already talked about AI, and I do think we need to watch it. Chris brought up integration. You brought up integration. That integration's key. Now, I'm not saying that AI companies. I think they still struggle to make money. That doesn't mean that you can't use technology to make yourself more efficient. And this goes, as I said, it touches a lot of things. It's builds mainly on the idea of resilience, right? We're talking about the ability to better connect supply chains so that we understand when those issues arise and in the future how they're going to arise. And yes, it does mean we need to think about black box products, but the reality is, if we want to look into the future, we have very few ways to do it without a black box interpretation. So we're going to need to be thinking about that, get used to it. And as I said, the other place that's probably short-term impact is we need to think about job loss. We need to think about some of those disruptions coming. And again, automation is going to come back. There's a lot of companies out there that haven't upgraded manufacturing facilities for automation. So I'm expecting there to be an opportunity for that.
All right, we have just a little bit of time left, and I want to end on a positive note. So I'm going to go first to Yer and then to Chris, and then I'll give Josh the last word here. When you're thinking long term, what kind of technology investments are you really considering?
Yeah, I'm glad I'm going first then, because this way we can kind of crescendo into some positivity. I think if I look back at my sort of take on sort of the thematic outlook for 2025, that emphasis on self-reliance, one long-term innovation I think that's going to be very worthwhile to continue to monitor and even invest in terms of R&D and technology development would be anything related to novel approaches for critical minerals and metals extraction, such as biomining, but even going as far as deep sea mining. I think you wrote a piece about 6 months ago about sort of not getting too overblown on sort of critical mineral shortages because we're going to continue to increase mining capacity for a lot of various kind of minerals and precious metals. But sort of in this self-resilient, self-reliance sort of paradigm, some countries just lack those resources domestically. So even if capacity does increase in terms of mining, it's not in their own country. So, instead of waiting too long and too late to secure the sort of supply that companies need, the idea that we can see is sort of finding new routes to secure these metals, whether that's biomining or deep sea mining. Obviously, there are a lot of barriers around deep sea mining, mainly around environmental concerns. But again, sort of when it comes down to necessity for economic sort of stability and growth, access to these raw materials will potentially prevail in some form and position deep sea mining really well in the long term. Less drastic and environmentally disruptive, though, is of course biomining or biological extraction. And I think that's really going to be a key area to look into for the mid to long term.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my pet technologies. So I'm glad to hear you mention it. Chris?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, kind of easy low-hanging fruit to mention here. Things like direct air capture. We know we'll need that long-term as a source of CO2 and, opportunities during near term and things like that. But, I think if I look at maybe one thing that's been a little bit overlooked, I'd look toward advanced conductors, high temperature superconducting wires, really anything that allows you to unlock more transmission capacity through an existing grid. There's some near-term things like dynamic line ratings that we're already seeing today, more kind of getting more out of what you have. But I think at some point, we're using a lot more electricity. We will continue to use more electricity. And securing rights of way for new transmission lines is very challenging. So figuring out how do we actually get more electrons through an existing right of way is going to be a problem we need a solution for. So I think we'll see more interest in investment in those.
Interesting. Josh, I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, I guess to think about wrapping us up here, again, not as exciting as I want to be, but in the long term, we just can't forget about biosynthesis. I've kind of harped on this already, but there's clear challenges for supply chains. And so there is going to be a solid opportunity for these. There's a lot of products out there that are getting really expensive, and their supply chains are challenged. Chocolate, right? A lot of these climate challenged ingredients, for instance, have an opportunity. And again, it's not about sustainability. We're talking about resilience here. And so, there is a clear opportunity, and we're already seeing movements in that area for these types of things. When you see a company like Fonterra and DSM come together to produce an alternative dairy protein, that just shows you that they're seeing a real opportunity. That is a lot of resources, a lot of expertise with a maturing technology, pulling in all the resources necessary to do that. And yes, it's still early. Consumers are still thinking about the availability, but if you balance that with the level of disruption we're seeing, all of a sudden those opportunities get really interesting. And that's where I think we really need to think about this.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that in a lot of different ways, all three of you kind of arrived to very similar comments around using these technologies that have been developed over the last maybe 5 years, not just to improve sustainability, right, but to leverage resilience, to increase output maybe from existing systems, whether that's a mining system or the grid, and to really create value propositions for these technologies that go well beyond just carbon emissions reduction or reductions in impact, but really create something that's holistic to the business. And I think that's where we'll see durable impact and where we'll see some really durable value. Well, with that, I want to thank my panelists for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. We, I think, have time for maybe just one question. Again, you can type those into the questions box. And if we don't get to your question on this call, we will be in touch after this webinar. But I want to, I open it up, and maybe Chris, I'll come to you with this one. But in the energy we've seen in the energy industry, we've seen this incredible amount of hype around AI and data centers. Josh has touched on it. I was a little surprised to maybe not hear it as much from you, but we have had some questions on it. So can you just share a few words about what you see with data centers and AI?
Yeah, it's been we've joked it's kind of it's not a discussion with anyone until anyone mentions data centers, right? It's come up at SAF conferences, hydrogen conferences everywhere. The reality
Chemicals
is
conferences, yeah,
right.
cool.
No, it's a very large, immediate, near-term need for a large amount of power. So we've seen really, I would say, a big scramble to secure that power reliably. But I think everyone knows that story. Beyond that, I would highlight question marks over what is actually demand going to look like for electricity from data centers. We know it's going to be, it's kind of like we used to joke about EV forecasts, 10 years ago. They all go up to the right. That's kind of what data centers look like right now, but there's a big difference between, orders of magnitude potentially in some of the forecasts we've seen. So there's some unknowns there. And, unknowns in terms of what happens inside the data center. A lot of focus on improving efficiency, novel cooling methods, a lot of really interesting things that we've been talking about in terms of thermal management materials happening inside the data center as well. So I think really it's all about the data center for the energy industry. Not as much kind of use case applications. I don't think we really see any really novel applications for deploying AI within an energy company to solve problems, as much as it's about how do you actually help everyone else use AI and provide the infrastructure essentially for AI.
All right. Well, with that is going to conclude our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording of this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. After you complete this webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey on today's webinar. We would appreciate any feedback you have. That really helps us improve our presentations, dial in on exactly what you want to hear. And we encourage you to check out some of our other research, and we have upcoming webinars on a wide range of different topics, including some of the things we've talked about today, energy efficiency and data centers being one. So with that, I want to thank you again for your time, and hope you have a very productive 2025.